Baring Foundation. For those of you that don't know, it's the Baring Foundation. It's a small foundation that runs social justice and arts programs in the UK and an international development program in Africa. I was very excited about this morning because I always wondered who comes to breakfast meetings, and now I found out. I always thought they were an invention of the devil in a city with long commutes, but I'm delighted it's attracted so many of you. The other reason I wanted to do it is because Caroline asked me, and I admire Caroline enormously, and I think what she does with Alliance is tremendous. I just want to say a couple of words about the theme. The first one is actually relates to Alliance. One of the topics that you'll discuss today is about retention. I wonder what on earth is this problem about retention in the foundation sector. I think the problem in the foundation sector is how on earth to get rid of us. How do you refresh organisations that are mainly immortal with staff who have permanent contracts and stay for a long time? We had a meeting here of our international development programme at the beginning of the year, and the person on the stage was, at that point you need to know I've been working at the Baring Foundation for 10 years, and I was sitting next to a young wag of a much younger vintage who had just entered the sector, and the person on the stage was saying, well, if you look all over Africa, you will see ageing despots desperately clinging to power. And the person sitting next to me turned around and said, pretty good description of the Baring Foundation. So, other than who's, how do you get rid of us? How do you refresh us? And I think Alliance does a completely fantastic job in that, in giving us new ideas and new questions. I am much more interested, and I hope we'll discuss the topic of diversity, how we have a more diverse workforce. Some foundations have the awful quip where equal opportunities, we recruit from Cambridge as well as Oxford. We all know that that the social demographics of elite universities are becoming narrower and narrower. How do we fight against that in the terms of the people that we're recruiting? And the last thing I want us to think about is temperament, which isn't part of the discussion that we've got so far. What, in terms of temperament and qualities, what makes a good grant maker? What sort of qualities of patience, of objectivity, of judgment are necessary for good grant making against the excitements of running your own programme, of actually being in control of your operational charity, and what different qualities should we look for in grant makers? And I very much look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, David, and thank you to start by welcoming everyone here, but also with some thank yous to the Baring Foundation for hosting us today, and of course to ING, who've actually let us have this room, and thank you to Baring Foundation for the great breakfast and hospitality. Also, we're holding this event in association with the Association of Charitable Foundations, which I'm very happy to be doing, and we've got David on the panel. And finally, thank you to everybody for coming this early hour. I didn't think I was going to make it myself with so many hold-ups on the tube, so I'm glad you all did. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Caroline Hartnell. I'm editor of Alliance magazine, which focuses on philanthropy and social investment worldwide, and you should all have copies. So the topic for the Breakfast Club this September is the people in the philanthropy sector, and the title of the issue is simply Talent for Philanthropy. And the starting point for the special feature was that there is a lot of discussion about foundations and philanthropists' financial resources, and how they can best be used in grant making and increasingly also in impact investing. But there's very much less talk about the people in the philanthropy sector, who are, after all, the ones who will largely determine how those resources are used. So they are arguably the sector's most important assets. So the question we focused on were, do we think enough about what sort of people the sector needs, and do we do enough to attract and retain them? And I clearly see that one question we actually neglected was, how do we get rid of them? So maybe that's something we can talk about later. The other issues that David raised, we do touch on in the magazine. Whether we'll be able to touch on all of it today, I don't know. Certainly, there's an article about diversity, and the issue of temperament, what sort of qualities are needed, is also something that sort of runs through the special feature. So enough from me. I'm going to start now, just introduce, we've got a wonderful panel today, so we'll just start at the far end with David Emerson, who's Chief Executive of the Association of Charitable Foundations, so I expect most of you know, as your sort of member. Okay. We have Paul Ramsbottom, who's Chief Executive of the Wolfson Foundation. Then we have Sandra Schwarzer, who's the Global Director of Human Resources at Open Society Foundations, and she was a contributor to an article in the Talent for Philanthropy special feature titled What Talent Do We Need?, which is what I'm going to be asking her about in a minute. And finally, but not least, next to me we have Elizabeth Marks, who's a leadership and board search consultant internationally with Stonehaven Search London. She's the author of a book called The Power of Global Teams, and she's also author of an article in the In Alliance looking at the challenges of working globally. So that's our panel. We obviously want to hear from all of you, so this is meant to be a discussion, not a sort of, we're not going to just present and go away. We'll have some talk from the panel, and then we want to bring in everybody who's here. You'll undoubtedly have just as much to say as we have. So I want to start with that what talent do we need question. So what sort of people does the philanthropy sector need? So we looked at in the magazine the issues: generalists or specialists as programme staff, permanent staff or consultants, people from outside the sector, from the business sector or public sector, or from within the sector. So those are just some of the, and then of course we also looked at this issue of attributes, the sort of personal qualities that we might be looking for. So as somebody who works on these issues globally, I'm going to start by asking Sandra, what are your thoughts on some of these things?
So good morning, everybody. I need to preface this with those of you who don't know Open Society Foundations. We're George Soros private philanthropy, meaning we do not have to go fundraising. And that changes significantly what we do. We give away we have an operating budget of $870 million per year. We have about 1,600 staff globally. It's a very different environment than what probably a lot of you are dealing with. But nevertheless, we have the same challenges. What kind of people do we want to have? People are our biggest asset. They will determine how well we do and how much impact we can have in the world. And we're a typical foundation in the sense that the Human Resources Department, until about 2 years ago, was focused primarily on paying people on time and telling people what they couldn't do. And so we're shifting our HR strategy quite significantly, becoming a more talented, people-focused organization. And what we're finding is there's different kinds of roles, and we're trying to bring in talent from outside of the sector. And we're finding it really difficult to attract the right talent, one, because nobody knows us. And then there are a lot of roles that are so specific that if you do not have the expertise in the field, it becomes very hard to do your job well. Because if you're not an expert on public health or on human rights for marginalized populations, it's more difficult to have the credibility. And so we're trying to see, how do you mix those two populations, the generalists that come in maybe from the business sector, from nonprofits, from other sectors, from the government, and mix them with people who really have focused their entire career. We're also an organization where we have a lot of staff who've been there for 20 plus years. And then we have a lot of staff who've just started in the last 3 years. And one person told me once that there's not a glass ceiling at OSF, there's a cement wall that you hit fairly quickly. And so we used to have a turnover of over 60% for our junior positions, and of 0.5% for our mid-management and upper positions. So we're trying to balance that. I'd say the kind of person we need, you have to be passionate about what you want to do. I think passion really drives you, but you particularly have to be passionate to be able to learn and to have an open mind. And for us, the culture fit is extremely important. I think everybody thinks foundations are the same, and they're not. They're as different as companies. And if you don't fit in, and if you don't share our culture and our values, You can be the star and you can be the best expert, but it's just not going to work out. So we look for a lot of fit. One way of doing that for us is our website almost gives no information about Open Society Foundations. If you can deal with that, then you're a pretty good cultural fit for the organization because of the complexity. So let me stop there.
Okay. Okay, so I'd like to just ask Paul now, because Paul, I think I'm right in saying, I hope I've been misinformed, that you came to your position as Chief Executive working up through the ranks in Wolfson Foundation. So how do you see that, the advantages and perhaps the disadvantages of coming from within the sector and indeed within the foundation?
Well, the first thing to say is that I really welcome this conversation and the way that Alliance is shining a light on this particular issue. I spent quite a lot of time talking about the fundraising profession. I was involved to some extent in Pierce report on fundraisers within higher education. And it struck me this morning that this is the first time that I've ever been in a forum where we're talking about the philanthropy workforce. And I think it's very much to be welcomed. The Wolfson Foundation, I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, but perhaps just place it in a wider context. The Wolfson Foundation is possibly an interesting case study because we've been recruiting staff for 6 decades. And there's an interesting evolution over the years. In the early years, the people running the foundation were senior military figures. I think it's true actually of a lot of philanthropic organisations. Having had distinguished military careers, this was a sort of semi-retirement job. They didn't really need the money. It was a sort of gentlemanly pursuit. And then, I suppose from the 1970s, the board took the decision that they would recruit senior civil servants. Again, people doing the role generally as their last job before retirement. And again, that worked well, but had a certain dynamic to it. And so I'm the first appointment of somebody who would say that they work in the philanthropy profession, and was appointed 6 years ago from within. And I guess to that extent I might be part of a wider trend, just in the sense that there are now more jobs in philanthropy. It's still an incredibly small sector in the UK, and I think that's one of the things we'll come back to. It touches very much on David's point about how do you move people on? Well, one of the problems is that there's sort of nowhere to go. I mean, I put that crudely, but I think it's something that we'll come back to. From the 1990s with the lottery distributors, I think grant making has expanded. There are now vocational training courses, some kind of formalised, such as through Cass Business School, some run by ACF, which means that I think for the first time in the last 10 or 15 years you can think of yourself as having a philanthropy career. But to come directly to the question, I think when we're recruiting at the foundation, the key thing is the skill set, the skill set for a particular role. And ideally, I think you probably have people who are bringing in skills from out with the kind of relatively small philanthropic sector, as well as those who have got some experience within. I think we probably would want to avoid the type of accusations that are often thrown at the political elite these days, that actually they haven't had a world beyond the world of politics, and therefore it's a very kind of introverted and internal conversation. I think that's the danger. So I think a mix. I think it would be an unhealthy sector if you had no senior people within it who saw themselves as philanthropy professionals. On the other hand, if the whole sector had gone through a similar process, had got similar qualifications, then I think we would be poorer for that. So when we're recruiting, it's the skill set rather than the specific background. That's the key thing. I guess very much coming back to what Sandra was saying.
Okay. Elizabeth, do you want to say something on this as you work in recruitment?
Well, my background is I'm a psychologist and leadership consultant and work with international organizations for the last 20 years, and I also do searches at board level. I got involved in this area really via international not-for-profit and philanthropic organizations to help them find international board members reflecting the geographies they are working in. So finding African, Indian or Southeast Asian board directors for some of them. And then also through that work got involved into making some suggestions how some of the practices from the corporate world could be translated or brought into the philanthropic sector. So I was invited recently to present some of the ideas of my book of the Rockefeller Foundation. That was a talent conference organized with some of the large foundations, but also small worldwide, and I presented some ideas for those organizations who work internationally, what would help bring high performance teams in a global context together. Now, to come to the question of talent, obviously sitting in a search firm, we should be very well able to spot and attract and make suggestions how to develop talent. But what we see primarily is, and that I think is very interesting for all of you here, there is much more interest in this sector from corporate executives. I have never seen over my 20-year career more interest in doing something in not-for-profit or philanthropic sector from very senior executives. And this is not just people who want to have a career change, but former chief executives who want to get involved, but have some problems identifying where their skill sets could be used very effectively. So that's something I think that would be an interesting point to discuss maybe later on. You know, how can I help, for example, if I identify or come across these individuals, you know, is there sort of a central place for me to talk with someone saying, well, these are the skill sets, this is what the person is looking for. You know, do you have any suggestions on what organizations may need them, in what form, and we could have a very, very effective collaboration through this. In relation to then with the interest, you know, what are the attributes? I think particularly the larger philanthropic organizations, and particularly US-based organizations, are of course asking, do we have the right skill sets, and how we developed, and how can we offer a career quite similar to the corporate sector? So when I interviewed a couple of people on this talent issues in different sectors, you know, there is a clear trend. I mean, what people from the chief executives from the philanthropic organizations say, well, we are quite wrapped up on the values and passion front. So we are looking for passion and, you know, the values of the individuals. Now, the corporate sector obviously concentrates more on the technical skills. So I think you've got to bring the two together essentially, and you have to find people who have the right technical skills, who have the passion to work in this area, who can identify with the values and have an intrinsic motivation to bring something to the table that's really bigger than themselves, and work in an environment that can create impact. And I think it is similar to the recommendations I make in the corporate world. We have to get away to recruit in our own image. I mean, it's a common human mistake. You know, we should recruit our friends in our own image maybe, but certainly not for an organization, because if you have an organization of clones, that will never succeed. It's as simple as that. So in a way, the best advice I can give from a search perspective is to step back and think strategically and quite continuously at times, you know, once or twice a year, what does the organization need for the future given the programs that we have, and do a much more sophisticated analysis of, you know, what are the key skills that you've got and what you need, and whether there's a match or whether there's a gap. And I think that's sort of the start to become more focused in the search criteria, and it will help you with your interviewing process. I think the second thing to ask then is probably, well, how does this person really implement the skills? You know, what is the leadership style, and what sort of impact will they have on the organization? And that's the personality or the softer features or the leadership style. And it's very, very important, because you may have the right technical skills, but if you don't have the right leadership styles, you know, you don't have a very well-performing organization. And then, of course, the third question to ask is, what is the fit? Similar to what Sandra said, what's the fit with the organization? You know, is there a match with the intrinsic values? And that's also a motivational fit. And I think the more systematic you can get and the more objective you can get around those questions, the better your recruitment will be. Now, as you can see, the logical consequence of asking this question is immediately you open up the talent pool, because you look at people that are different from yourself, and you look much broader, and so you look much broader in what are potential strong executives for you, and with that, I can guarantee you get much more diversity in the organization in the widest sense, and you will perform much better, and you have a much higher chances of success with that strategy.
Thank you. David, do you want to say anything on this?
Quite a few things. I think first that I welcome this topic. It's great to be raised. For ACF, this is something, we are the Membership Association for Trusts and Foundations. This is something we think about regularly. And my colleague Catherine takes calls and talks all the time with people and has greatly informed what we want to say today. Let's just start generally about staff in philanthropy. And why, and David initially talked about retention, and why people are keen to stay and enjoy it. And that feedback is because, and it's not just hinted at it, money is not the object in raising money, is not the object in philanthropy. The key currency is knowledge. And that has three implications, I think. First of all, you're working with staff who are open to learning all the time and are really interested in things. They've developed their knowledge over a long period and often considerable expertise, and they are incredibly generous about sharing it. We're not competing. It is the most generous world to be in of information. So you put that context in, it's a very positive, it's an exciting, it's a rewarding atmosphere. That's the context within which you're working in philanthropy. So what's needed, the other thing to say, is that the core of this is about relationships and trust. That's really what we think working in philanthropy is about. And so the role for us in association is about providing the safe and supportive place for individuals in philanthropy, somewhere where they can come and share ideas, where they can come and pick up expertise from somewhere else, where they can, well, particularly that sharing and networking. Many foundations, we should talk about size. I think many of you will know there's 20 big foundations, and even those, the biggest and staffing, welcome aside, is something like 20, 25. We are not, unless they're operating and running things, but for grant making, we are not talking about very big organisations. And when you get down beyond that, you quickly get down to fewer staff. And we have many foundations who have soloists. And so for those individuals, people who are running the foundation on their own, we also provide some space for networking, for contacts, and in a way a kind of collective memory, collective identity. What else is the sector doing that is difficult for a foundation with one room of staff to hang on to? Or to put it another way, we provide a professional development program that enables individual foundations difficult to do because they're small organisations. So hopefully we provide two things, a range of events that are about developing your professional skills, and we provide another range of events, member-led, which are about the issues, about penal reform, about education, whatever else, environmental funding, so that members can come and share experience. So in that way, we're supporting and helping retain. But I think, one of the things that I think is crucial to come back to is about trustees. We were talking about staff in trust and foundations. Those of you who are involved will know that trustees play a fundamentally greater role, and particularly in the recruitment of chief executives. And I think trustees do have a responsibility for their involvement in decision making about the atmosphere they set, and about particularly the relationship with the chief exec. And I think it's an interesting balance, because the trust and foundations, the executive has less power than equivalent sized charities. I won't go into the details, but you can be a major operating charity dealing with millions of pounds, and the board see you every 3 months, you report, and then you go away and do the work. In a foundation, you will often find that a chief exec can't even spend £20,000 or £10,000 in a major without approval. Very much greater role of the foundation trustees. And yet, those trustees are heavily dependent on the information, insight, and recommendations of their staff in order to perform their responsibilities properly, and the relationship with trustees. And I think what the downside is that the costs of not recruiting good staff, of not running very well, are not felt by the foundation. They are felt by the grant makers. They are external costs. And what I think that does risk meaning is there actually isn't a lot of pressure on foundations to do it properly if they don't want to. I will be very careful in my phrasing, but if you look around, you will have seen some transfers and moves of chief executives over the last couple of years in foundations, which are possibly the result of a difficulty in relationship with the trustee board. I think for trustees of major foundations, this is the really difficult area and where we could do more. There's no external pressures on them to do well, to behave well, and I think that can be a difficulty for the recruitment of chief executives. I think that is one area. And I think the worst. A foundation can operate and recruit any staff it wants, carry on quite happily, and there's no external feedback to it. So that would be, if I was going to be very open about it, I think that's a possibility. Mostly, I come back to saying, trust and staff in trust and foundations are absolutely, they're wonderful people to deal with. You talked about the passion, other things, the commitment. And I think we have our issue, as David said more likely, is about how do we move people on. I could look around the number of staff who've been, I can see in the room who've been 10, 20 years or more in foundations. It's a wonderful job. Retention isn't the issue, support for them and providing the right atmosphere, and also this critical relationship between trustee boards, independent trustee boards, and the recruitment of a chief executive. And I think there is an area to look at.
Okay, thank you.